Hello and welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab Talk. I'm William Uricchio, Professor of Comparative Media Studies and the lab's Principal Investigator. And today I'm going to talk with Patty Zimmerman and Louis Massiah, the people behind We Tell, a touring program that chronicles 50 years of participatory community media through 41 media projects. Broken into 6 parts, the program will be presented by ODL as a virtual screening series this month and next. This is a particularly resonant event for our lab for a couple of reasons. Louis and Patty were scheduled to kick off the series last March. This was one of those events that we dithered over in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic before finally deciding to cancel it. I think it was really the first thing we officially canceled. So time warp, here we are back again, enabled by Zoom. Secondly, the media at the core of this project, participatory, variable in form, micro in focus, and emphatically about place, align closely with the work that the Open Doc Lab has been doing in co-creation, place-based media, and social change. We Tell documents the use of media as tools for democratic discourse, change, and a way to confront power, all topics that are close to our collective hearts. And finally, a number of filmmakers included in the program are old friends and sources of inspiration. It's really great to see so many of them in the collection. And for me personally, this brings back the early 1970s and my days with the 20th Street Video Collective in New York, complete with editing sessions with the then brand new Downtown Community Television Center. Okay, on to our guests. Louis Massiah is a documentary maker who honed his skills here at MIT, where he received a Master of Science in Documentary back when that was possible. That's a great moment. He is the founder and executive director of the Scribe Video Center in Philadelphia, a media arts center that provides production workshops to community groups and emerging independent media makers. His work as a teacher, change maker, and filmmaker has been recognized with the MacArthur Fellowship and numerous other awards. Patricia Zimmerman is Professor of Screen Studies and co-director of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival at Ithaca College and an old friend of the lab. Her most recent books include Flash Flarity, Tales from a Film Seminar, this year, 2021, Documentary Across Platforms, Reverse Engineering Media, Place and Politics, came out in 2019, and Open Space, New Media Documentary, A Toolkit for Theory and Practice, 2018. Almost a book a year, and there's another one coming. So, okay, Louis and Patty, first, can you each add something to this biographical sketch that I'm sure gets repeated everywhere you go? What's something that most people don't know about you or your work that you care to share? Patty, anything?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to really thank you, William, Claudia, and the MIT Open Documentary Lab for hosting us to share our ideas and our process about how we mounted We Tell 50 years of participatory community media. Rather than really sharing something about myself that people wouldn't know, I'd like to share something about We Tell that maybe people wouldn't know, since that's the topic today. And that is to say, it took more than me and Louis to mount this. This required a huge collaborative team of people from Scribe, and Louis can shout out some of their names, Haijun Park and others, all kinds of people working on licensing, and the Transfer Collective, which is a group of archivists committed to archiving and recovering the histories of alternative media and independent media that might not be in official archives. So the work in this project actually in some ways echoed or took as its model the way in which these participatory community media projects were done. And so I am nervous about taking any authorship on the process. We call ourselves programmers and not curators in order to really emulate this idea of honoring that it takes many people to put these together. So
terrific. Well, good to see the I become a we, and certainly embrace that ethos. Louis, anything to add?
Sure, and yeah, this has been very much, We Tell has been very much of a collaborative effort, and I think that it came out of a kind of need, but also a kind of joy. In that the need is that in some ways there has been an amnesia about this form of media making, this form of documentary making that has been vital to the field, and losing that somehow or other makes us think the documentary. We forget a really important kind of leg in which the documentary stool is kind of standing on. But the joy is that these works that really reflect collectives, media arts centers, sort of ad hoc groups of filmmakers, some individual filmmakers, but works that are oftentimes created collectively in conjunction with movement, really seeing the energy that continues till 2021. So just there's that joy of the work, and really the power of the work that kind of inspired us. But Patty, from the beginning, when we sort of conceived of this, we got initial funding. It's interesting. We initially went to NEA. We sent in an application for NEA and we were rejected, and then we went back again and were supported. The part of the early joy was really the research and really figuring out what's the work that's there, and how do we tell the story, and how do we structure it to share it with a broad public.
So as far as I know, this, and correct me, I could very well be wrong on this, but this is not like an established genre. I mean, de facto it is. There is ample community media, but there wasn't, that set didn't really exist there. Like I know a lot of the work in this collection, but it's usually in different sets. It's under different rubrics. Tony Buba's work is, seen as part of this kind of eccentric auteur independent filmmaker in outside of Pittsburgh, but not necessarily like you wouldn't say, oh, Tony Buba, that's a community filmmaker. So is this? So have you been inspired? What inspired you to come up with this rubric or this category? It's been there this whole time, but somehow aggregating these pieces and putting them into one label makes suddenly something visible that was always there, but we didn't see it. And now it's like glaring,
I think the word participatory is actually more useful than community in this description, in that these are works where the subject has authorship, and where the films, what's in front of the screen, what's on the screen, has a direct relationship with the lives of those behind the screen, and that's as opposed to films about other or So that and the fact that community media allows that much more than sort of auteur filmmaking is kind of why the two are kind of grouped together.
So I'm curious, just how did you parse that space? Because arguably a lot of filmmakers necessarily have to there's a fair amount of participation with the subject. Granted, there's a whole spectrum, and just Kat and I just wrote a book about it. There's quite a spectrum of modes of participation. Where do you draw the line? Like what constitutes robust enough participation to be included in the series, as opposed to something where someone was embedded in a community for a while and really worked with people, listened to people, but ultimately you wouldn't really call it participatory. Like
Editorial,
yeah.
editorial control, editorial, being able to making those decisions, since production is really about decision making, being involved in those critical content decisions. That's a prime reason for participatory, in terms of decisions about subject, decisions about framing, decisions about editing, that editorial control.
And so in your research process, because this isn't always some films emblazon this on the front end. They talk about how they were produced and how this indeed is a community effort. Some are a little less obvious. If you know about the production or you know the makers, you might know it to be the case. So I assume that's part of your research process, kind of trying to ferret out projects that, based on the surface, you wouldn't really know. So how did you go about that?
I'd like to take that on and also link it to your question about defining participatory community media. So I think when we think about how documentary is figured in the world, it has devolved in a certain sense to two poles: theatrical features that go in the festival circuit and get distribution, and then on the other hand, streamers, television. And these are often feature-length projects. For us, documentary is a very heterogeneous and complex ecology with many, many layers. And I think even if you look at a lot of the books people use when they teach documentary, they're really oriented to big budget, big projects, and they may be participatory in that they were worried about the ethics of how you deal with subjects. But this work is quite different. So this is setting its sights on work, I would say, beyond broadcast, beyond festivals, beyond museums, and looking at work that has use value. We've often called this a cinema of utility. This is a very heterogeneous ecology, a very complex one, comprised of places, people, practices, politics, and processes. And I think that as we're looking at this, it is dispersed across the United States. And a little bit about our historiographic methodology, Louis was really insistent that the work be spread across the US and not just be located in New York and the LA, San Francisco, which is kind of the cliche of where independent documentary happens. So that's one thing, is looking for regional diversity. The second is to think about this as very much place-based, but also dealing with unresolved political issues that require democratic participation. So one aspect of participatory community media is that none of these projects are feature length. They're all shorter forms. And as Dee Dee Halleck said in a meeting we had with her about this project when we were starting it, they're short for a reason. It's not just because they're no budget. They're short because their exhibition practices also different for other forms of documentary. These are shown in communities, shown in political groups, shown in movements, and they're meant to galvanize discussion amongst people. I think of these works often as a kind of trampoline, right? That they jump us into other areas. And they're also meant to mobilize people to have agency, to organize, to do something. And I think that's a very different kind of documentary practice. One last thing I'd like to say is it's an archival conundrum of dealing with these works because of all the different formats they're on, but also because community media is not a fixed object. Many of these works have many different versions. They're redone, they're re-edited. We have some that have been retitled. They go out in the world and the people who worked on it don't like the title anymore. So you're dealing with something that is very mutable and permeable. And I think permeability really on every level, philosophically and politically, really defines this work.
Wow, lots to unpack there, Patty. Let me just jump in right at the start. So you talked about trying to get a good spread in the nation, not just the media centers. Any surprises there? Are there wastelands, or are there places that turned out to be far richer? And if so, what? Can you give an example and maybe why? For example, I'm spent part of my life in Pittsburgh, and I'm always dazzled by what an intense scene there is of things that don't really make it out of the city very much. But in the city, it's profound and rich. Why? I don't know. Pittsburgh is a strange place that way. With you think of the origins of public radio, the origins of educational TV, the origins of it's a weird city. The Nickelodeon started there, the official Nickelodeon. That was so interesting. Why Pittsburgh? But I want to hear your idea. What did you guys discover? Any patterning to this kind of production across the nation?
It does seem to me that resources do matter. The fact that there is some kind of media ecology, some sort of infrastructure, either intentional or by circumstance or happenstance, that allows things to develop. Whether it's a media arts center. A place like Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, which was quite intentionally created, and the Community Media Workshop in Chicago, which still exists, created at the same time. Although there is some public access work in this, but the infrastructure around public access also allowed for community media work to develop, and I'm thinking of Novak in New Orleans. Sometimes it comes out of a very, very clear reaction to industry and to the political economy, and how does one wrestle the tools and the resources from the industry to movement work. And so certainly the newsreel development sort of comes out of that. I mean, people who may have day jobs working for networks, sort of carrying the cameras outside, or even visual communications in Los Angeles. Many of the folks have affiliations with the film school at UCLA, realizing that the Asian American community does not have those resources, sort of set up visual communication. So you do need resources, but Patty's earlier comment about these works often being connected to political movement is I think a really important kind of fuel for what allows these works to exist.
Yeah, if I could just pick up on that, if it's okay. As we've been out talking about this, I find there's a lot of interest in technologies, right? What were the technologies used? And again, this is an archival, I almost want to say nightmare, because there's so many technologies here, right, in this history: 16 millimeter, half-inch quarterback video, cable access, satellite, DV, mobile phones, social media, drones, and beyond. And we're always really careful to say it's not just technology, and it's also not just place. It is also politics. These works and these movements emerge out of collective politics around issues that deeply matter to people's lives. And I think often documentary, different forms of media get located in a very artisanal model that is what matters is my own self-expression, right? And I teach at a big film school, so I'm immersed in this, right? This work is the opposite. And I think this work is across the country really responding to really urgent, unresolved political issues, whether it's Asian American representation, or in this case on the slide, the Black Panthers. This was made by San Francisco Newsreel. They were white filmmakers, but they collaborated with the Panthers, and the Panthers insisted that the title of the film be changed. It was originally Off the Pig. Well, it went through many iterations, and they insisted it be Black Panther. So I think as we're looking across the United States, we are trying to be very rigorous about looking for other locations. And every time you find another location, you find complex politics of urgency that require people to come together to resolve. I'll just give one example. We wanted to document and find the community media from Occupy movement. And our archival team, Transfer Collective, felt it's such a visual cliche that it's all New York City. So they found Occupy footage that was from the West Coast, from the Northwest, and it was shot at night, which was also it's very unusual to see those demonstrations at night. And it shows people in those demonstrations who are not just 20, 21 years old, young people. It shows a bigger range. So that would be one example I would give, that you have to, we had a historiographic model of keep looking regionally. And there are different political economies of how this work got made and funded. There's also different politics engaged in this work. Some of these early media collectives came out of federal initiatives to do job training in the 60s in impoverished areas to give people access to the media industries. So they had this kind of idea of training people to get them into commercial industries. And then they became something else, a way of telling stories that are from that community's lives.
So just to drill down a little bit here, it strikes me that, so 50 years, and we'll talk about, maybe you can even answer why 50 years and not 70 or 60. But if we go back to the 60s, it's a really nascent moment for some of these institutional practices that you just mentioned. For example, the job training programs, but also the emergence of film studies in a number of universities. That's starting to creep into the university curricula, late 60s, early 70s. By the 70s and 80s, community cable is starting to become a presence, and therefore both a distribution platform and some equipment, if you could con your way into it. There seemed to be a number of elements out there that facilitated these projects. Now, I think none of them were imagined as being in alliance with the political projects you mentioned, but all of them were made good use of by people with political agendas. But I'm just wondering about that ecosystem. So why 50 years, and does that emergent ecosystem have much to do with it?
Yeah, I know Patty just talked about let's not sort of overvalue technology, but certainly the emergence of the Porta-Pack and the emergence of accessible synchronous modes of recording have a lot to do with having the tools to do the work. But certainly, if you look at the earliest works, the newsreel works, it is about the struggle for Black empowerment. It is about the anti-war struggles that really are the fuel that kind of create the work. Or it is about going forward, looking at AIDS activism. It is about people fighting for their lives that creates ACT UP, using media as an important tool. So I'd say that it is the politics that's on top of it, of everything, and you use what tools are accessible, and you use your intelligence and your tools to sort of create the work and to go forward. And the 50 years, it's also conveniently, it's a nice round number, and it's arbitrary in some ways. And it's actually 51 years if you really look at our catalog carefully, but who cares? But it does, but 67 does seem like the beginning of, because of technology, because of movement, it seems like a beginning of this sort of effort and this movement of work.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that because it's, as a historian, periodization is where we always start, right? And to justify this periodization, we spent a lot of time discussing how to organize this and what the scope would be. And 1967 is the date of the Portapac, and so many people that we talked to describe the changes that the Portapac facilitated, which was accessibility, easier than 16 millimeter film. And we heard Judy Hoffman from Kartunkin Films just a week ago at the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival describe this, and that the ease of doing long takes with video connects with these political processes. But I'm always cautious about technological determinism because I think when you're looking at community media, I'm going to revise Malcolm X and say community media, participatory community media, is by any technology necessary and at hand. This is what is mobilized. To amplify Louis a bit, that period in the 60s is important politically. We are seeing this work and these organizations emerging within the larger context that many of the participants were operating in, of the anti-war movement, many people coming out of civil rights, Black Power, the Asian American movements, queer and gay movements, Latinx, political struggles around the environment. Environmental issues didn't just emerge, with Al Gore's movie and Elizabeth Colbert's books. This has a longer history with decarceration, with houselessness. So these are issues that were the fabric in which this technology and these projects are operating, and in which these media projects are contributing to dialogue. They're contributing to these dialogues. They're contributing to the political dialogue. They're contributing to raising consciousness. They're contributing to mobilizing people. And this is one of my favorite projects, M4BL, Ceremony, Movement for Black Lives. I just want to say our Carmel, one of our archivists, we said, find some Movement for Black Lives material. And the first thing she said is, everything is demos in the streets. Let's find something else. And so that was kind of a historiographic criteria. And this is a ceremony naming those who had been killed. It's very, very powerful. But what I would like to really emphasize here is these works are both part of politics, people are part of political movements, but they're also contributing to these political movements. And, one thing that really strikes me as we're even looking at the slides here, and that my students actually pointed out in my doc class yesterday, where we were studying Black Panther, I'm going to quote my students, and they said, when I look at the We Tell films, they're filled with groups of people doing things together, doing or talking. And one of the students said, and when you look at contemporary documentary now, it's filled with characters having emotional problems. And, that's maybe an undergraduate's reductionist statement, but I felt it was quite telling that when you look at these works, and even as our audience and our participants look at these slides, it's groups of people joining together. This is a anti-character driven kind of work. I don't think many of these works have narrative arcs. They are done in a more mosaic kind of structure. So these are really important issues to think about in terms of their differences, but also their urgencies. Oh gosh, here's another one I love. Cop Watcher's story from El Grito de Sunset Park. This is a group that is empowering people to use cameras to document cops. And it's a really important project. So I'll leave it at there and maybe pop it back to you, William, or to Louis.
Okay, so I'd like to just pick up a little bit on the exhibition side of this that you mentioned. You mentioned the kind of array of forms that these films, these media projects were shown in. Just to pick up a bit more on that, both from a research perspective, like given the political remit, the political weight of so many of these projects, I can say in the case of the stuff I know that I was part of, I don't think there's any there's not much documentation. It was about doing the work and getting on with things. So how did you come to terms with that? Is there much evidence, reception history of these, or like where they were shown, who went, how they circulated? Is there much of a circuit among cities? Were the movements the carrier of these from city to city, or how did that work?
I mean, so many of these, most of these works were not made for the places that the conventions and sort of of documentary making say, you're making things for, the widescreen or for television, and certainly many of these are pre-internet. Most of these works were made for very specific local usage, and they are films of utility. They have a very specific purpose. I do think that they have aesthetic and value, and I do think, and some do have narrative arcs to them. But
yeah.
but these are works that really are meant to address specific social, political spaces. So in terms of traveling, that may not have been in the vision of the makers. And some of the works did travel a fair amount, and so part of the struggle in putting this together was really tracking things down. Some of the works weren't credited actually in the finished pieces, because that went against the politics of the makers, and so part of the work was figuring out, all right, who actually made this work. Yeah, the archival work, which the Transfer Collective really was kind of guided, was really a major part of this effort of putting this exhibition together.
The historian in me can't avoid this question, but of course, over the last decade or two, there was a movement especially among early historians of early cinema, to really get hyper local in their research, to really understand the local production scenes, exhibition scenes, and often for material that never really made it beyond the city. Stuff that was, the films of audiences queued up to see the cinema that you'd show before the film as a lure. But there's a rich history of that, and any discussion, any connection with that site? Is that just a zeitgeist? This strikes me as being an equally place-based, issue-based, if you will, as well, kind of endeavor. At least in terms of shared challenges on the archival front. What do you do with hyper-local stuff where you don't have the big footprint that a commercial or a national project would bring with it? You've got to really be creative in your research on the research front.
This is something I love to talk about, as you know, William. I've dedicated my life to writing books on media practices that are totally invisible and marginal. And I think there's a politics to that historiography, which is to absolutely and resolutely decenter film historiography from its corporate centers and from its well-resourced centers, and to know that these media ecologies are heterogeneous, diverse, alive, and also scattered, right? And the way in which early cinema historians work, I think, is similar to the kind of methodologies we used here, which is, first of all, you have to understand what matters is not the archival documents you find, but the rigor of the questions you continually ask, that you have to know you're absolutely dealing with absences, that you're absolutely dealing with the fact that you're not going to find the papers of the activist archivist on the screen right now in the Library of Congress. You're looking at a dispersed archive that you are making in your project. This kind of work requires a lot of discussion. It's amazing to me how films and cinema scholarship has ignored this kind of community media work. People in development communications have written more on this, but how does one do this? It's through constantly asking questions, having a model in your head that you want to be regional, and second, and most importantly, realizing that there is no archive, that your work is going to be to create that archive, and that you're constantly going to be asking questions because the work is unfinished. Every time we get together with makers involved in this project, we discover more stories about how the work was produced and what their process was and how it was used. The most recent was Judy Hoffman with HSA Strike 1975 about medical residents striking in Chicago. And she talked about how the activists came to her and asked her to do this work with them. And they collaborated on what would be documented. In terms of how the work is shown, again, it is recapturing stories from people and just to be rigorous about knowing that you do not know everything. And I'll just end with an anecdote. We really debated, what do we call the people who make this work? Because the word film director is rather auteurist, filmmaker, is kind of Robert Drew directs cinema, avant-garde. When we came up with the term maker, which was Louis' genius, these people are makers. So then we decided let's get a bio of every maker. We have about 100 on there. And this is really difficult because, as Louis said, many people are anti-auteurist who worked on this. They're a collective. Secondly, their credits were seen in many community groups as very bourgeois commercial media, a kind of hierarchy. And so they put some names on, but not all names were there. We had a team of two people helping to research this. And every time we find someone, they tell us about someone else. Transfer Collective went through all the visual material in the show and scrutinized the end credits, which I will add often did not match what was in the online catalogs of some of the distributors or organizations. This is a continual unearthing, and it's a very exciting one because you find that a lot of people who worked on this didn't end up in the film world. They became lawyers or dancers or artists or political activists. And it's a fascinating story. It was just so amazing and humbling to learn about not only these people, but also about all these different organizations. And, for our audience, it's important to remember many of these organizations have celebrated their 50-year anniversaries, like Visual Communications on the screen now, Cartumpkin, Apple Shop. These are long, these organizations have long histories. So for us, the makers and the organizations are of equal importance.
Great. I want to open the discussion up. We have some panelists here from the lab and also some questions from the audience. So let's first see if folks here have any questions that they'd like to bring to the table. Kat.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really energizing and inspiring and exciting. And I'm just curious, I mean, you've done so much already to bring this material and this work to audiences across America, United States. I'm wondering, is there any as you rebuild or create the archive? We had Janine Marchessault in this series a few weeks back with her beautiful project, Archive Counter Archive, in which they're bringing artists and makers in to reconsider the material. And I'm curious, is there any effort or interest to rework the material visually, either online or in a feature film or any other kind of work?
Okay, Louis.
I think, well, we live in a system where intellectual property is something that is owned, and some people don't respect that, and some people do. I respect that. And so all of these works are licensed, or there is someone who one can say is the owner of this work. So it's not quite as, I mean, one first has to get permission to show the work, part of the process, part of the archiving process, part of the production process is sort of getting a license to screen the work. And each one of those negotiations is a different sort of experience. But then again, the idea of sort of combining them into some sort of new form, I don't know. I mean, that almost goes against, unless everybody's working collectively to do this. It sort of is saying like the auteur is now going to take this, this community produced work and sort of create something beyond. Which is, I probably would watch myself, but it's not necessarily something that I'm personally interested in doing. But I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I'd like to make just a simple point, which is, we had a rollout of this project to 20 sites, and Louis and I talked a lot about. There's a little bit of an irony here, is that it was museums, film festivals, and universities where this work, when it was made, would probably not be shown. So and why do that? And of course, it's because universities, museums, and film festivals can legitimate work and give discursive space to something that's been very marginalized. And that's been very important to say that this work really matters. The second point I would make is that these works would have not been shown together. We packaged this in 6 programs that are thematic. And these 6 programs are what Louis and I saw as continuing unresolved political issues that you see work kind of grouping itself around. And so one of our historiographic tactics, which was to create contiguities, that means side-by-side historiography, between these works. So putting Kartemkin with work from the West Coast, those works would never have been put together. So was very important to us to put those together, because our historiographic intervention, if you will, was to mobilize, for me, a kind of theorization of contiguity. But then there's a problem, which is you have all that contiguity. Were we going to edit these together? And there was a point where I thought, well, Louis is a brilliant filmmaker, and this will be a montage of all this stuff colliding together with collisions. And then we realized, we had this moment of reckoning that this needs to be chronological. So there's 2 elements in each program. There's the contiguities side by side of putting works together that would not have been together when they were made. So that's the new part. And there's also a continuity, right, going this way that is historical. And I want to give a shout out. We put them together, and my brother, who's a corporate executive, was in Houston, brought his family to see them. And afterwards he said, this was so incredible to me, but I didn't know what year I was in when I was watching it. And he said, you know, in my corporation, we're really big on dates. And full disclosure, my brother's an economist for a big company. And he said, you know, you and Louis need dates. You just need dates. And so I remember
after that, we changed it.
We changed it all. We were in Houston, and, you know, my brother is telling me all this stuff. And he says, oh, I know you and Louis are going to like make fun of me because I'm a corporate guy, but you need the dates. He goes, if you want to get people like me who don't know anything, you need the dates. And so I emailed Louis in the middle of the night, and it was changed immediately. So there are dates there so that people know where they are and can think about it. And my third point is, at some point, we would love to see these programs we made licensed by academic institutions so that people who taught documentary could expand the landscape of documentary to include a broader ecology than those works that are either televisual for the streamers or which are art cinema ambiguous films using art cinema models. We think that there's an enormous complexity in this work artistically and politically. So our goal, I would like to see this infiltrate literally higher education in terms of how we train people in documentary, journalism, and news.
You're here. Artemis.
Yeah. Hi. And I just want to say that I'm having the most wonderful moment of deja vu because I actually caught the program, you know, during the Chicago run in January 2020 and the workshops. And in fact, actually had a long phone catch up with Judy Hoffman last night. But this is just such an amazing chance to revisit this wonderful program. And I want to pick up on the kind of this idea of utility on the level of exhibition and kind of its kind of connections to civil engagement. And, you know, I do think that even though you did this packaging and that you did include festivals and museums in your kind of new distribution model, that you also, I think, tapped into kind of the original kind of counter network that existed kind of in that 1970s moment as well, you know, the community media centers and the, you know, universities. So I think that in a way, you know, you were sort of reactivating that as well. And I guess that kind of now, especially since it's sort of like, hopefully not the end of your roadshow, but kind of, you know, after all of this, you know, year and some month cycle since when I first saw it to where you are now in terms of rolling this out, I just kind of wonder about like its reuse value beyond historiography and whether or not these films kind of still you know, have a kind of a way of engaging, you know, creating publics and engaging civil engagement dimensions.
A couple of thoughts. So yes, I mean, I know for me, some of all of the presentations and screenings have been quite wonderful, but certainly the screenings at Apple Shop and Novak, and Scribe in Philadelphia,
Echo Park in LA.
Echo Park, you know, sort of media arts centers that that really are part of this tradition of participatory community media making mean a lot. Also because it brought back many of the makers connected with the work. But certainly one of the purposes of We Tell was looking at the 21st century, you know, and beyond, continued utility and importance of this kind of media. I mean, looking at the Movement for Black Lives piece, looking at the Cop Watchers piece, there are real needs and uses for today, you know, beyond the academy for this work. So helping people to think that, and also in some ways distinguishing between maybe just simple capturing of material and putting it on Instagram or Facebook, but really looking at the construction in a documentary form and as a way, the language of these works, and seeing that this language has this very much current day usage. I will say that, you know, the We Tell series will continue to have screenings throughout 2021, and we, you know, and maybe we'll continue beyond. I mean, so as a package and as this collection that Patty and I put together, it will have a life, and we have done extensive documentation of what got us to this point. So yes, many uses, many utilities for this work and for the series.
Yeah, can I just add to what Louis said so eloquently is, you know, one thing that one learns researching, you know, was like 6-7 years in this world to produce this project, is that community media is adaptable and mutable and changes in different contexts. And I think what you see in this project is we have 6 programs: body publics, collaborative knowledges, environments of race and place, states of violence, turf, and wages of work. And you know what stuns me sometimes is that these are 6 huge areas that America has never resolved, that continue to require our attention and our political organizing, and continue to need these makers to tell a different story. And you know, here I would quote Salman Rushdie, who said, "There is not one story, but we dip our cup into a sea of stories." And I think that this work is a polyphonic sea of stories. And these are a sea of stories that reminds us that we are not alone, that we are with others in political community to speak truth to power, but also to reclaim democracy.
Wow, those sound like the words to wind down with, Patty. That's eloquent. And damn it, there's some good questions in the Q&A that we're not going to get to, alas. We're just about out of time, so I want you all to join me in thanking Louis and Patty for their time today, but especially for their crucial work in making this body visible and coherent and bringing it to us.
William, could I just make a final comment? It's very quick. I'd like people to end with a little party favor from me and Louis, which is the 8 Ps of participatory community media, which we have sort of developed from talks like this: polyphonic, place, people, DIWO rather than DIY, politics, process, power, and passion. And I'd really like to thank the MIT Open Documentary Lab, William, Uricchio, Kat Zizak, and all of you for sharing this discussion with us today. Deepest collaborative and participatory thanks.
Yes, thanks so much. Anyway, good to talk, exchange.
Thank you, guys. And we're going to be streaming the films the programs week by week, so that you can reach through our lab. And join us next week, same time, same station. Jessica Clark and Kamal Sinclair will be with us. So great. Thanks very much, and see ya. Bye-bye.